I didn't fall. I crumbled. There's a difference. Falling is sudden. Accidental. Quick. But what I did out in that field wasn't quick. It was the slow, quiet kind of collapse that starts somewhere invisible, behind the eyes, beneath the ribs, and spreads like water soaking into the seams of everything you thought was holding you together. I hadn't planned to break down. Certainly not in front of anyone. And especially not in front of my horse. But there I was, face pressed into the sun-warmed grass, tears hot against my temples, breath coming in short, ragged bursts. And there he was. Maverick. Standing so close I could feel the warmth from his body before I saw him. He didn't nudge me or snort or walk away in disinterest. He just hovered. Still. Present. Solid, like the earth beneath me, but somehow more comforting. I rolled slightly onto my back and stared up at the pale spring sky, blinking away the wetness clouding my vision. I felt ridiculous. Weak. Broken. Go on, I muttered hoarsely. You don't have to babysit me. But Maverick didn't move. In fact, he lowered his head. I heard the shift in his breathing before I felt his breath across my cheek, soft, steady, grounding. I turned my head and met his eyes. Dark. Deep. Steady as stone. Fine, I sighed. Stay, then. And stay he did. The day had started like any other. Routine. Quiet. Deceptively normal. I'd gotten up early, fed the chickens, checked the fences, and brewed a 2-strong pot of coffee. Maverick was already out in the east pasture, waiting by the gate like he always did when he wanted attention but didn't want to admit it. I'd saddled him up without a second thought. The sun was high, the air just warm enough to smell like promise. But the promise didn't hold. Something shifted the moment I swung into the saddle. My fingers, tight on the reins. My shoulders, too tense. Maverick picked up on it immediately, ears twitching, gait uneven. I tried to shake it off. Deep breaths. Gentle nudges. But the panic hit out of nowhere. Like a wave I didn't see coming. 1 second I was trotting him in a circle, the next my chest locked up and my throat closed and my vision tunneled into a tiny point of light. I dismounted fast, too fast, and stumbled back. My legs folded beneath me. My hands hit the ground. And that was it. No drama. No big show. Just me, curled in the grass, trying to remember how to breathe. I'd only had one other panic attack in my life. It was 6 months ago, in a conference room filled with glass and fake smiles, when my boss handed me a 4th project deadline I couldn't meet and told me I should lean in harder. That time, I collapsed in the bathroom, hyperventilating into my own elbow, wondering how I'd become so good at pretending everything was fine. Now here I was, in a different world. One with dirt and sky and animals that didn't speak in buzzwords. And still, I was falling apart. Maverick shifted again, and I flinched, an old reflex I hated myself for. But he didn't leave. Instead, he lowered his body to the ground. It was so slow, so careful, I barely believed it at first. His massive chest lowered, legs folding beneath him. Hooves tucked close. He lay beside me in the pasture like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then, to my disbelief, he scooted closer. So close his shoulder pressed against my leg. And there he stayed. For a few minutes, I didn't do anything. Just breathed. Listened. The wind rustled the grass around us. A bird called somewhere in the trees. And Maverick's breathing, steady, deep, mimicked mine until I wasn't sure whose chest was rising and falling anymore. I reached out slowly and touched his neck. Warm. Silky. Alive. You're not supposed to do this, I murmured. He didn't respond. Of course he didn't. But I swear, he felt like an answer. I don't know how long we stayed like that. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour. Time doesn't behave normally when you're unraveling. Eventually, I sat up. Tried to stand. And that's when he did something I'll never forget. Maverick shifted his weight, just enough to press his massive shoulder against my knee and hold me there. Not hard. Not rough. Just enough. Enough that I couldn't rise without pushing him away. I stared down at him, stunned. Seriously? His ears twitched. I tried again, bracing my palms against the grass, but he leaned a bit more, keeping me grounded. He wouldn't let me get up. And I didn't want to. That was the moment I let it all out. Not just tears. Not just breath. But everything. The grief I hadn't cried about when I left my job. The loneliness I refused to admit when I moved here. The quiet guilt of having a life that looked peaceful on the outside and chaotic on the inside. I buried my face into Maverick's shoulder and let the sobs come, messy and hot and unfiltered. And he didn't move. Not an inch. Just breathing beside me. Anchoring me. Holding space. No judgment. No solutions. Just stillness. And in that stillness, I found something I hadn't felt in months. Safety. When the tears finally slowed, I sat back and looked at him. "You're too good," I said softly, running a hand along his mane. His eyes closed for a moment, content, calm. Like he'd done what he came here to do. And maybe he had. Because when I tried to stand again, slowly, this time, he let me. He shifted his weight off my leg, lifted his great body with that same graceful power, and stood. I followed, shakily, brushing grass off my jeans. We just stood there for a while, me and him, side by side. "I guess you knew I wasn't ready," I said. He flicked his tail once. I thought I needed to keep going. To be strong. To ride today. To prove something. I paused. "But you knew what I really needed." He stepped forward and bumped his nose gently into my shoulder. I laughed, just a little. And it felt like the first breath after a long time underwater. That night, I wrote in my journal. I hadn't touched it in weeks. Today, I didn't ride, I wrote. I didn't achieve. I didn't push. I didn't win. But I was held. By a creature who didn't speak my language, but still understood me better than most people ever have. He wouldn't let me get up. And I loved him for it. The next morning, I didn't try to saddle Maverick. I didn't even bring a halter. Instead, I walked into the pasture in my boots and hoodie, carrying 2 apples in the deep pockets of my coat and the soft kind of hope you're afraid to look directly at, like it might disappear if you noticed it too soon. Maverick was near the southern fence line, grazing lazily, his coat glistening with dew. He looked up as I approached but didn't move. Just watched me with that patient, steady gaze that made me feel like a living question he already knew the answer to. I stopped a few feet from him and sank slowly into the grass, cross-legged and quiet. He didn't flinch. Didn't look away. I pulled out the apples and placed them gently on the ground beside me. One for him. One for me. He blinked once, then walked over, no rush, no drama. He lowered his head and took the apple in 2 deliberate bites, chewing like a philosopher who had no need for small talk. I watched him in silence. Not out of awkwardness. But because I didn't need to fill it. And that in itself felt like something sacred. It had been months since I'd allowed myself to sit still like this. To just exist. Without reaching for a screen. Without checking a to-do list. Without trying to be productive or prove I was worth something. Maverick settled into the grass beside me again, folding his long legs beneath him like he'd done the day before. Only this time, I wasn't broken. I wasn't crying. I wasn't unraveling at the seams. I was just here. And so was he. We sat like that for almost an hour. Sometimes I closed my eyes and listened to the wind. Sometimes I traced patterns in the dirt with my fingers. Sometimes I just watched him breathe. He didn't demand anything from me. He didn't expect me to be cheerful or talkative or healed. He just was. And that stillness he carried, it started to seep into me. Softly. Quietly. Like light through a window I hadn't noticed was there. Later that day, I found myself thinking about silence. How it used to scare me. How I'd filled it with noise for years, podcasts, playlists, meetings, conversations that said nothing. As if silence meant failure. As if it proved something was wrong. But here, with Maverick, the silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of breath and heartbeat and shared space. Full of trust. That realization hit me like a whisper I'd needed for a long time. Maybe stillness isn't what happens when nothing's going on. Maybe it's what happens when everything important is finally allowed to speak. That night, I lit a candle in the old mason jar on my windowsill, the one my grandmother used to keep next to her reading chair. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't scroll my phone. I just sat, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, staring into the flickering light. And I thought of Maverick. Of how he'd laid beside me like we were made from the same earth. Of how he hadn't tried to fix me, just held me, in the only way he knew how. And I realized something that caught me completely off guard. I hadn't felt alone in days. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I sang. Not for an audience. Not to be good. Just, because I wanted to. I hummed softly to myself as I mucked the stalls and filled the water troughs. I even caught myself swaying a little to the rhythm of my own voice, like the girl I used to be before deadlines and breakdowns had taken her place. Maverick poked his head over the stall door and snorted at me. What? I grinned. Don't like my voice? He nickered once, something between amusement and acknowledgement. I rolled my eyes and handed him a flake of hay. Everyone's a critic. After chores, I returned to the pasture. No saddle. No rope. No agenda. Maverick followed me without hesitation. We walked the perimeter together, side by side, like two travelers rediscovering a familiar path. Eventually, I lay down again. This time not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. The grass was cool against my neck, the sky wide and impossibly blue above me. Maverick stood over me for a moment, casting a gentle shadow across my face. Then, without prompting, he lowered himself once more and stretched his legs beside mine. It was becoming a ritual. A quiet, perfect ritual. And it meant more to me than I knew how to explain. I reached out and touched his shoulder, fingers tracing the muscles beneath his coat. I used to think I had to be strong all the time, I whispered. That if I ever stopped pushing, I'd fall apart. He didn't react. But his presence said everything. And maybe I did fall apart, I admitted. But, maybe that wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning. A breeze stirred the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. Maverick blinked slowly, eyes half-lidded, completely at peace. I sighed and let myself relax completely against the earth. I don't want to rush anymore, I said. I want to stay here for a while. Just like this. And that's when I felt it. His muzzle, pressing gently against my arm. Not insistent. Not demanding. Just there. I stayed in the pasture until the light began to change, the golden hour brushing the tops of the hills with warmth. When I finally stood, Maverick rose with me. Slow. Steady. Like the rhythm of my breath finding its way home. We walked back toward the barn in silence, but it wasn't the lonely kind. It was full of something I hadn't known how to ask for. Company that expects nothing. Connection that doesn't need explanation. Love without conditions. That evening, I opened my journal again. I ran my fingers over the page, then picked up my pen. I think I'm learning to listen again, I wrote. To the wind. To the stillness. To the way Maverick breathes when he's near me. I used to think silence was empty. But now I know, silence is full of answers you can only hear when you stop running. He teaches me more by lying down than most people do with 1,000 words. And for the first time in forever, I don't want to get up too fast. I used to wear high heels and red lipstick. Striding through glass buildings with lattes in one hand and color-coded folders in the other. My name was printed on business cards with embossed gold letters, Clara Whitmore, brand strategy consultant. I was good at it. So good, people said my work spoke before I did. That I lit up boardrooms. That I owned the room. But the truth was, I didn't own anything. Not my time. Not my peace. Not even my own breath. Every day was scheduled down to the minute. Calls, meetings, revisions, travel. I was constantly chasing praise I didn't believe I deserved, burning through energy I didn't actually have, and promising things I had no idea how to deliver, just to prove I was still enough. Until one day, I wasn't. The breakdown didn't come in a dramatic scream or some cinematic explosion of papers and tears. It came in the form of silence. One morning, I walked into the office, set my phone on my desk, and stared at my screen for exactly 47 minutes without touching a single key. I don't remember what I was thinking. Only that it felt like I had fallen underwater, and everything around me was muffled and far away. When my manager knocked on my door and asked if I was okay, I smiled. But inside, something had already cracked. 3 days later, I walked out of that building and never went back. My therapist called it burnout-induced depersonalization. I called it, I don't know who I am anymore. I moved to the countryside not because I had a grand plan, but because I needed distance, real, physical, emotional space. Something to push against other than deadlines and expectations. My grandmother had left me this little patch of land years ago. I'd always meant to visit. But I never did. Not until I had nowhere else to run. I packed 2 suitcases, my laptop, and the single plant I hadn't managed to kill in my apartment. I didn't even know how to drive a trailer, let alone take care of a horse. Maverick came into my life 3 weeks after I arrived. He wasn't mine at first. He was loaned to me by a neighboring farm while they rebuilt their fencing. The arrangement was temporary. Just until things were fixed. Just a guest. He didn't seem thrilled about the relocation. For the first few days, Maverick kept his distance, silent, suspicious, proud. His eyes followed me like I was something strange and possibly untrustworthy. I knew the feeling. I didn't trust myself either. But things started to shift one chilly morning when I slipped in the mud carrying a feed bucket. I didn't fall, but I swore loudly and dropped everything into the dirt. Maverick was watching. I looked at him, defeated, and muttered, "Yeah, that feels about right." He blinked. And then, as if understanding, he walked over and lowered his head toward the spilled grain, eating calmly, slowly, like he was saying, "It's fine. We'll start again." That was the first time he let me touch him without moving away. I remember running my fingers through his mane, feeling the tension in his body melt ever so slightly, and realizing, maybe he was just as unsure about everything as I was. From that moment on, something unspoken grew between us. I started spending more time outside. Not to ride. Not to train. Just to be. I'd sit on the fence rail and hum old songs under my breath. I'd read aloud from books I hadn't touched in years. Sometimes I talked to him about nothing. About everything. About the kind of pain you don't name out loud. And he listened. Not with words. But with his ears. His breath. His stillness. And slowly, the walls inside me began to loosen. I remember one afternoon, gray sky, wind-threatening rain, when I found myself sitting in the pasture, arms wrapped around my knees, staring into the middle distance. I had just gotten off a phone call with a former colleague who asked if I'd found myself yet. I laughed bitterly and said I wasn't sure there was anything to find. The silence that followed felt like a verdict. Maverick came up beside me as I sat in the grass, and without any hesitation, he lowered himself again, laying down with a deep exhale that rumbled in his chest like a sigh only ancient creatures could make. I turned to him and said, "Do you think I'm broken?" He looked at me. Unmoving. Unblinking. And in that silence, I heard the answer I hadn't let myself believe. No. Not broken. Just tired. Just carrying too much for too long. That's when I started thinking differently about strength. It wasn't in how fast I could run, or how high I could climb, or how long I could endure. It was in how honestly I could rest. How bravely I could let go. Maverick seemed to know this instinctively. Any time I rushed, he resisted. Any time I tried to force myself back into the old patterns, early mornings, strict schedules, goal-oriented days, he would block me. Physically. Once, when I tried to get him into the trailer for a practice ride, he planted his hooves and wouldn't move, no matter how gently I coaxed or pleaded. I gave up, frustrated, and sat down in the grass. And without hesitation, he lay down next to me. I laughed through tears. "You really don't let me run away, do you?" He just blinked, like it was obvious. The phrase kept repeating in my mind. He wouldn't let me get up. Not because he was controlling. But because I needed to stay still. I needed to feel. To rest. To breathe again. And it terrified me. Because stillness had always felt like failure. But with him, it felt like coming home. I started journaling every night, like a ritual. Not for anyone else. Just for me. And in those pages, I began to tell the truth. Not the polished, Instagram-filtered truth, but the messy, aching kind. I used to believe that being strong meant carrying everything alone. Now I think strength might be the exact opposite. Letting someone, something, stand beside you while you fall apart. Letting go of the idea that you always have to bounce back. Maverick doesn't ask me to perform. He doesn't praise me when I bounce back. He lies beside me in the dirt. He meets me in the quiet. And slowly, I am learning to do the same for myself. One morning, I woke to the sound of hooves outside my window. I looked out and saw Maverick standing still in the mist, facing the house. Waiting. Not impatient. Just present. I pulled on my coat and walked out barefoot, the grass damp and cold beneath my feet. He met me halfway. I didn't ride. I didn't even bring the halter. I just sat in the field, and he lay down beside me. And for the first time since leaving the city, I didn't feel like I had to earn this peace. I just let it be. It was the kind of morning that tried to trick you into overdoing it. The sky was clear, the sun just warm emu. Red old men against the rising slope of the pasture. And Maverick, as usual, watched from the hilltop as I started working. I ignored the dull ache in my lower back. The twinge in my shoulder. The way my hands already stung from holding the hammer too tight. Keep going, I told myself. You're fine. You're finally making progress. Don't slow down now. But progress, I've learned, can be a cruel illusion. Especially when your body remembers what your mind tries to forget. I made it halfway through the second panel before the world tilted. One moment, I was tightening wire around a post. The next, I was blinking up at the sky from the wet ground, the taste of dirt on my tongue and the buzzing in my ears loud as bees. Pain radiated through my ribcage. My right leg throbbed. My vision swam. I tried to sit up, instinctively, stupidly. And that's when I heard the sound. Hooves. Fast. Urgent. Approaching from the hilltop. Maverick. I turned my head just as he reached me, his breathing heavy, his nostrils flared with concern. He stood over me, head lowered, ears twitching. "I'm okay," I tried to say, but my voice came out thin, breathless. I reached for the fence post to pull myself up. But Maverick stepped forward, and pressed his chest gently against my legs. Blocking me. Holding me down. "No," I whispered, wincing. "Don't do this again." But he didn't move. He stood there, firm and silent, eyes locked on mine. I pushed against the ground again, harder this time. He shifted slightly. Not to crush, not to control, but to anchor. To keep me there. To say, without a single word, don't get up yet. I wanted to scream. Not at him. At myself. At my body, for failing me again. At my pride, for convincing me I could outpace my healing. At the whispering voice that still lived somewhere in my chest, the one that said rest was laziness, stillness was weakness, and the only way to earn your place in the world was to keep moving, no matter what. I covered my face with my hands and let the shame rise. But Maverick didn't flinch. He stayed. Warm. Immovable. And for the second time in our strange, wordless bond, I let go. I lay back in the grass and stared at the clouds. They moved so slowly, like they had nowhere to be. Like the world could spin just fine without me hurrying to keep up. I started to cry. Not hard. Not with noise. Just quiet tears that slid down my cheeks and soaked into the earth like rain. And all the while, Maverick stayed right there, his weight across my legs, his breath brushing my skin, his presence like a wall between me and everything I was afraid to feel. I didn't know if 30 minutes passed or 3 hours. Time stopped mattering. All that mattered was this: he knew. He knew I wasn't okay. He knew I was pushing too hard. And he wouldn't let me escape from that truth by standing up and walking away. Eventually, my breath slowed. My muscles relaxed. The pain in my leg dulled to a throb, manageable and real. Maverick lifted his head, watching me carefully. "Okay," I whispered. "You were right." He exhaled deeply, like he'd been waiting to hear me admit that. I reached up and touched his shoulder, fingers curling into the short, coarse hairs. "You always know, don't you?" He blinked once. Then stepped back. Letting me go. But not abandoning me. Never that. I didn't stand right away. I rolled to my side, sat up slowly, and breathed. Really breathed. Felt the air move through me like something holy. Maverick waited patiently, his body curved slightly around mine like a question mark. When I finally rose to my feet, he walked with me, slowly, step by step, back toward the barn. No rope. No lead. Just us. I didn't fix the fence that day. Didn't cross a single thing off my list. But I wrote something in my journal that night that mattered more. I don't need to be the strongest person in the room. I just need to be someone who knows when to stay down. Maverick held me in stillness again today. Not because I was weak, but because he's wise. Wiser than me, most days. He doesn't measure progress in finished tasks or miles ridden. He measures it in honesty. In breath. In how willing I am to stay on the ground when my soul is asking me to pause. The next morning, I woke to a still ache in my leg and a strange calm in my chest. I didn't rush. Didn't make coffee right away. Didn't open my planner. Instead, I stepped outside barefoot and stood in the grass as the sun rose, watching the fog lift from the hills like a curtain opening on a quiet stage. Maverick stood at the far end of the field. I didn't call him. I just waited. And slowly, inevitably, he came to me. We didn't ride that day either. We just sat. Me cross-legged in the grass. Him curled beside me in that now familiar way. I rested one hand on his neck. Closed my eyes. And whispered, "I don't want to run from the quiet anymore." He pressed his muzzle gently to my side. Like an oath. Like a promise. Like he'd make sure I didn't. The next week, everything changed. Not in one single, sweeping moment, but in 1,000 quiet shifts. Like frost melting off a leaf. Like breath-warming cold hands. I no longer started my days with plans. No pressure. No performance. Just coffee, stillness, and Maverick watching me from the pasture like the guardian he had always been. I spent more time lying in the grass than riding in the saddle. More time listening than speaking. And I began to understand, healing isn't about getting back to who you were. It's about growing into someone who can carry your own truth. And that truth doesn't always look strong. Sometimes it looks like staying on the ground. One morning, a letter arrived. Not a bill. Not a delivery. An envelope, handwritten. I turned it over in my fingers like it might vanish if I held it too long. It was from my former team lead at the agency. She had heard I'd left the city, heard rumors I was off-grid. Inside the letter was a polite invitation to return for a consulting opportunity, short-term, high-paying, and high-stress. My chest tightened. My first thought was to ignore it. My second, prove to myself that I could still do it. My third. I walked outside. And let Maverick decide. He was standing by the fence, waiting for me, as if he'd already read the letter himself. I didn't speak. I just sat beneath the sycamore tree, the letter folded in my palm, and waited. After a while, Maverick came over, as he always did, and lowered himself beside me. I leaned my head against his shoulder and whispered, "Would going back mean I've failed? Or that I've healed?" He exhaled, slow and steady. I closed my eyes. And listened. But this time I didn't hear an answer. I felt one. A sense of quiet knowing settling over my chest like a warm blanket. I didn't need to go back to be whole again. Because I was no longer trying to be who I used to be. Later that evening, I walked into the barn and pulled out my grandmother's old calendar. Each page was filled with notes she'd scrawled by hand, names of horses she'd cared for, vet appointments, birthdays of local foals. In the margins, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A short sentence, repeated across several pages. Stillness is not weakness. It is the deepest kind of knowing. I traced the words with my finger, and they settled into my bones like truth passed down through generations. That night, I wrote a letter of my own. A gentle, grateful refusal. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to apologize. I just wrote what was real. And then I stepped outside, barefoot in the moonlight, Maverick grazing quietly in the lower field. "I'm staying," I said to the stars. This time, not because I'm running, but because I'm ready to stand still. Maverick lifted his head, and even from a distance, I felt him hear me. In the following days, I started building something new. Not a career. Not a legacy. A sanctuary. I cleared out the old guest paddock and fixed the fencing with patience, not panic. I made a plan, not a rigid one, but a living one, for taking in rescues. Horses like Maverick. People like me. Souls that had carried too much, for too long. And slowly, word spread. First came a call from a woman in the next town. She had an older mare that couldn't work anymore but still deserved peace. Then, a message from a friend of a friend, asking if I could help place a neglected gelding with nowhere else to go. I said yes. Because I had space now. Not just in the field. In myself. The first new arrival was a bay named Aspen, skinny, scarred, skittish. I stayed with her through the first storm, whispering stories while the rain hammered the barn roof. Maverick stood nearby the whole time, calm and solid, showing her without words that this was a place where fear could settle and soften. The second was a miniature pony with a crooked leg and a larger-than-life attitude. I named him Oliver. He made Maverick snort in disbelief daily. We all found our rhythm. Not perfect. But real. One afternoon, while brushing Maverick beneath the big oak tree, I leaned against his shoulder and whispered, "You started this, you know." He flicked his ear. "You laid down next to me and wouldn't let me get up." I smiled. And it saved me. I pulled out a small, hand-carved wooden plaque I'd made in the shed that week. I had planned to hang it above the barn door when I was ready. I read it aloud to him first. Sanctuary still. For the ones who stayed down, until they could rise whole. Maverick pressed his nose gently into my chest. I didn't cry. Not this time. Because this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning I never would have reached if I hadn't stayed on the ground long enough to remember what mattered. That night, I lay in the pasture beside Maverick again, just like I had on the first day. But this time I wasn't broken. I was whole. The stars stretched above us, wide and infinite. The grass cradled us from below. And Maverick, my silent guardian, my teacher, my stillness, lay so close our breath moved as one. I looked at him and whispered, "You wouldn't let me get up until I learned why I had to stay down." He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. His stillness spoke for him. And I loved him for it.